Hey, Cara.
Hello.
So good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you as well.
For those who are watching and not familiar, Cara Meredith, she is the author of the book, The Color of Life. And she and I are going to be talking a bit today about something that we have in common, which is that we are both white women raising black children. And I want to give this caveat right from the beginning. I hope that if you are a person raising white children, you don't decide, hey, I'm not interested in this conversation, because I think much of what we're going to talk about is really stuff that is applicable to everyone raising children of all colors. But I think we both have had some unique learnings and experiences in raising children of color. So we're both going to read a section of our books, and then we're going to talk about it.
I can't wait.
You ready for this?
I am. You go
All
first.
right. All right, I'll go first. Okay, let me put my reading glasses on instead of pretending like I don't need them. And let me find my little section. Okay. This is from my book, Raging Against the Minivan. And I actually have two chapters where I talk a bit about race. But this is from a chapter called The Myth of Colorblindness, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Okay. So this is coming right after I share a story where my boys both experienced some racism from another child. And what happened was the mother of the other child said, I have a hard time she wasn't there. And she said, I have a hard time believing that this happened because I have taught my child to never talk about race. So that was her disbelief. Like, well, we've said never talk about race. Jimmy's mother's next response, in my opinion, illustrates the root of the problem. She told me that her son had always been instructed to never talk about another person's skin color. So she was having a hard time believing that he said out loud that my son was black. At this point, I might have lost my patience a bit. And through gritted teeth, I reminded her that he is black and that pointing out that he's black is perfectly fine with me and not an insult. What was insulting was the fact that her child didn't want to hold the hand of another child because he was black. Probably because he's been taught at home that saying someone is black or brown is something taboo. Therefore, the message is sent that people of color are inherently problematic and scary, too scary to even talk about or name. It's not just parents who can be in a lot of denial that this stuff happens. I've sat in a parent-teacher conference where a preschool teacher patted my hand and reassured me, kids don't notice color, or these are all really sweet kids from good families. Racism has to be taught. Okay, can we all just circle up for a moment and finally put this narrative to rest? No, racism in the preschool set does not have to be taught. A kid does not have to have a parent who flies a Confederate flag and openly uses the N-word to do something cruel or stupid to a child of color. Any more than a kid who makes fun of someone for wearing glasses means that his parents hate people who wear glasses. Sometimes good kids from non-racist homes can have moments of being terrible. It does not serve anyone to believe the fantasy that a child cannot spontaneously exclude or insult another child for their skin color unless their parents taught them to do so. Sometimes it happens as an experiment in exclusion and difference, and sometimes it's learned not from parents but from society. Racism is embedded in the systems of our everyday lives. Kids pick up on the subtle and unfair hierarchies that stem from those conditions. It happens. Way more than we want to believe. And by we, I mean white people, because people of color know this shit goes down and are probably quite sick of our denial systems about it.
Thank you. Do we comment yet, or do I start reading mine?
I don't know. Yeah, no, you read yours.
Man, I should have taken notes. I was so enthralled watching you, as those who are going to be watching the video will see as well. But so from yours, I do talk about colorblindness quite a bit in my book, more my own experience growing up of colorblindness. This particular story, though, focuses on an incident that happened with my boys when we were living up in Seattle. So the kind of the caveat or the story behind it is that I developed horrible hives, and my husband was working late, and so I had hives covering my body from top to bottom. I was swollen, and just it was it was a story.
Yeah.
And I had to go to the pharmacy to get a prescription, and
Mm-hmm.
it happened at 7 o'clock at night. Our boys were young at that time; they were 2 and 4,
Mm-hmm.
and they usually are ready to go to bed.
Yeah.
So that's kind of setting up the scene. I didn't have a choice but to take them with me to go to the pharmacy to get medicine for these hives. It was in this state of wildness that Cannon, Theo, and I, those are my sons' names, put on our bravest faces and drove a quarter-mile down the road to the grocery store. Everyone else in town seemed to be at the prescription counter that night as my fully clothed body itched and I tried to get the boys to sit crisscross applesauce on the floor. Past the point of no return, as the pharmacist rattled off a list of directives for my steroid pills, the boys began to play Ring Around the Rosie around a display sign. That's when she stepped out of line. "Don't you know this is a store? Don't you know you're supposed to be quiet, that you're not allowed to act this way, that you shouldn't be running around a grocery store in the first place?" As her shouting continued, everything within me went silent, gunned down by her outburst. Rendered mute, I couldn't utter a word in response. Meanwhile, the boys stared at her, wondering if they should smile, if they should say hello. The pharmacist stared at her. I stared at her. Every patron standing in the line and pushing a cart around the aisles of Safeway stared at her, aghast. Even if a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old are acting like a primitive pack of hyenas, you don't yell at the children. You yell at Twitter. You yell in caps lock to everyone on your social media platforms, but you don't yell at the babies. I picked my jaw off the ground, wiping tears from my eyes. Grabbing their hands, we began the slow march away from her and from the scene of hurt. The perfect words of retaliation would come to me in an hour or two, but for now, we just had to get out of there. "Have a nice day," I shouted over my shoulder, a bit of snark mingling with my tears. But she wasn't done with us yet. "Just a reminder, you're getting a tax break for those things." I stood there as tears rolled down my face. The boys stood there silently beside me while the adults nearby stood mute to the spectacle, mouths hung open. "Lady, I'm doing the best I can," I replied, and looked at the kind-hearted, Cheerios-loving, Curious George-obsessed, snuggly, doe-eyed sons I loved more than life itself. I thought about who they are. I thought about how the way I see them isn't always the way the rest of the world sees them. I know the iceberg of humanity that lives beneath the surface, an iceberg of feelings and personality, of likes and dislikes, of brilliant, spongy minds who want to learn and do good and please their mama and daddy, of children of God who are loved simply because God loved them first. "It sounds like you just encountered your first taste of racism," my friend Renee said to me a couple of days later. As I am often prone to do, I had begun to laugh about the encounter, blown away by a stranger's audacity toward my children and toward me. The laughter was mine alone, though. I shook my head vehemently, not wanting to believe that someone would judge my babies by the color of their skin, not wanting to admit that someone would believe her white body to be better than their brown bodies. But when we make people the other, the social norms are not the same. As Renee reminded me, in American culture, we don't often see Black boys as boys, but we see them as men. The expectations become different for them because these young boys don't get to be children. They become things and tax write-offs instead of 2- and 4-year-old boys who fancy a game in the grocery store. For Renee, a biracial woman who identifies as Black, there wasn't a question in her mind that I had tasted the bitterness of racism. The smile on my face waned. It was no longer a laughing matter.
And you know, I think I relate to that story so much. And it's difficult because I think for women who are not raising children of color and have not had these sort of repeated experiences, it's probably easy to say, well, yeah, someone yelled at me like that, or someone yelled at my kids like that. And I think that's true. But it's interesting because I have the experience of raising in a parallel process 2 white children and 2 Black children. And they're similar ages. I mean, 2 of them are the exact same age. And the difference that I note in the way that the world treats the girls versus the way the world treats my boys. And I don't think it's gender, because I noticed that the white boys that I know are treated differently. But just as you said, there seems to be a heightened suspicion. There seems to be a heightened expectation that they're older than they are. And I'll tell you, I mean, just this week, there were two different instances. One was my boys were, one of them had a Zoom class. The class got shut down, as they do, you know, like the teacher lost connection. Sure. And my boys started to play wrestle for the rest of the class, like performative wrestling. Sure. Because they're dumb. Not appropriate. Completely not appropriate.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I later got an email that included the principal on it that insinuated that one of the boys was assaulting the other, and then the words "fled the scene" were used in regards to him leaving the frame of a Zoom call. Again, white parents might be listening to this going, well, you know, but it's when this kind of stuff happens over and over and over again. No one has used the term "fled the scene" with either of my white children when they've done stupid stuff. And then this was 2 days ago. One of my boys was riding a scooter by a neighbor, flashed a peace sign, and the neighbor decided that he flipped him off and screamed at him. Wow. And my kid came home going, I don't know what happened. Like, that neighbor just screamed at me, and I was just flashing a peace sign. And this kid, he can do a lot of stupid things, but I believe that he was flashing a peace sign. That's on brand. Flipping someone off randomly is not on brand. And so, you know, there's just these repeated kind of microaggressions that happen to our kids. And is there any overt racism that we can say they were called the N-word? No. But things happen that we as parents go, this is just too much. Like, this is too much to all be coincidental.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, I think it's so important to point out and talk about too. You and I both live in the state of California. We're in different ends of California.
Yeah.
But this is not something that is unique to places like the South, for instance, where we might say, oh, more overt racism happens.
Right.
But pointing out again that the microaggressions are embedded within culture. Yeah. And that the story that I told, that was when we lived in Seattle, which is a fairly progressive city. But it's also a very white city, both historically and present day. And it's no different living in California. No. So what does it mean for us to be aware? What does it mean, regardless of whether it's our neighbor, which obviously was someone that you knew, or at least have somewhat of a regular seeing or noticing relationship with, but then also the principals and the teachers, and what does it mean to continue to be aware, to continue to talk about this, not just when big incidents happen, but when the everyday incidents, which is what both of our stories, all of these stories are, when those happen.
Yeah, and I want to point out too, I think what's really difficult and maybe even more nuanced for us in that, you know, as you said, we live in California. I don't live, you know, in a state where people are flying Confederate flags or using the N-word. And what I believe to be true, and what I think white people really have to grapple with, is that I think a lot of this is unconscious racism. I think in probably every instance that you and I are describing, and there was an incident that happened this week online where a woman had been confronted by a bird watcher. He was black. She didn't have her dog on a leash in an area where it was supposed to be leashed. Sure. He asked her to leash her dog, and she began calling the police, telling the police that a black man threatened her life. That was her reply, and he videoed it. Here's the thing. Do I think that person, or the woman that you met in the grocery store, or, you know, any of the other scenarios that we've described here, do I think these people are racists, that they think of themselves as racist and you know, consciously dislike black people? I actually don't. And that's what's so scary. I think that these people have underlying bias, and they are behaving in racist ways. But I think we have been raised in a racist culture, and we have swallowed so much bias. I mean, this woman was like acting terrified of a black man in a park who asked her to leash her dog, acting terrified, and then using that to weaponize and calling the police and describing him as a black man. And I think that white people have to do the work to unseat our unconscious bias against black and brown bodies, because it's not going to happen by just saying like, oh, everybody's equal.
Absolutely. And or by, back to point A, believing in or adhering to a colorblind rhetoric. And for those of us who are parents, teaching our kids that not seeing color or not seeing ethnicity or race or whatever other definer of outside skin, that shouldn't be seen. But instead to say, okay, so what does it mean to enter into this? So yes, if your child notices and says, oh, look, a black man, then you don't shut down that conversation. You say, that's right, he has brown skin. What color brown is your skin? What color is your skin? You know, even if a child identifies as white or European American, what does it mean to look at the new box of Crayola crayon colors and to say, oh, that's right, you are one of these shades as well. And so what shade are you?
Yeah, and I know you talk about this in your book, and I talk about this in my book, that both of us were kind of raised with this ideal of colorblindness.
Absolutely.
So what was the moment, or, you know, moments for you where you started to go, maybe this notion of colorblindness is not serving us well?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just first a quick story. Colorblindness was so embedded into my culture. And really, I mean, that's a huge part of, it was for those of us who were raised in the 70s and 80s. Yeah. It was what happened as, it was what happened in response to the civil rights movement and to getting wrong conversations of color. So then we swung the pendulum.
Overcorrected. Yeah.
Overcorrected. And I mean, I remember being in the 4th grade in the auditorium at school, and our principal, all 600 kids, leading the school in a chant saying, "We are colorblind." You know, so there I was 10 years old, screaming along with my classmates who were mostly white, but there were several kids of color, and we were all shouting that. So for me, I mean, God bless Oregon in the mid-'80s, right? But I mean, this wasn't just Oregon.
No, I was raised the same way. Absolutely. The same way.
We thought it was correct.
Yeah.
So for me, honestly, I was a high school English teacher, and then I was in ministry for several years. And for me, being in ministry and working primarily with kids of color, I think that's when I first began to notice that for those kids of color, their racial identity, their ethnic identity was one of the most important parts of who they were. I worked for a Christian organization, and so it was one of those that we were very much taught to say, yes, Jesus is the most important thing, God is the most important thing, and this is another conversation for our post-evangelical days between you and me, but it was one of those going, okay, wait a minute. Our faith or our spirituality is one of the most important parts of who we are. And also that lives alongside our ethnic and racial and cultural identities. Yeah. And we don't then discard that or smush that or negate that or anything. Yeah. But say, okay, so who are we? And that's not just then for people who identify as those of color, but it's for all of us, no matter who we are. For those of us who are white or European American, that we are also then digging into the roots of our historicity and of our people and of our ancestors. Yeah. And we're simultaneously celebrating and lamenting oftentimes. Yeah. But we're saying this is who we are, and we get to celebrate who we are.
Absolutely. And I think what's interesting for a lot of white people in that conversation in terms of celebrating other people's ethnicity is that there's some weird defensiveness because we're not really sure what our own ethnicity is. I mean, even when we use the word ethnic, that often is used to refer to something that's non-white. So white people, I think we sort of think we're the default, like we're just human beings. And then everything else is ethnic. And I think another piece of work that white people need to do is start understanding what is whiteness, because it's a thing. There are unique experiences, there are unique cultural values to being white. And some of them are terrible and some of them are benign. But I feel like until we can recognize, it's almost like how the bully has low self-esteem and they have to build their own self-esteem to like stop bullying. I feel like that is true of white people. Like, we need to understand who we are as a people so that we're not then tearing everyone else down, you know?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And what does it mean to then say, okay, as we are identifying not just our ancestry, but we're identifying, like you said, our whiteness.
Yeah.
Maybe we're digging into Robin DiAngelo. Maybe we're reading
Yes.
Kristen Howerton's new book, Rage Against the Minivan, or we're reading Cara Meredith's book, The Color of Life, and we're beginning to enter into that. But I think that also is where we then go, oh, and in and through this whiteness, when we're valuing whiteness so much, that's also when and how we're valuing white supremacy and the tenets of white supremacy that we don't even realize we're doing, that all of a sudden leads to those microaggressions that happen in the middle of grocery stores, that happen when our kids are throwing peace signs to our neighbors, when they're WWF wrestling after a Zoom call when they're not really supposed to. So, when we're then entering into those moments of stress, and we're not necessarily fully thinking, but all of a sudden we're jumping to that place. So what does it mean to recognize that? And like you said, to do the work.
Yeah. So I'm curious for you. I mean, you have the experience of, you kind of started grappling with these issues of race as a minister and as a teacher, but then you ended up marrying a man whose father is like a renowned civil rights activist. What was that like? I mean, what was that learning curve of being thrust into this family where this was at the forefront of their work?
Absolutely. I mean, that was certainly the greatest invitation into my journey, was realizing, oh, wait a minute, I can't just operate with the same ideals or beliefs. The first time I ever met James's family, my husband James is named after his father, who's also named James. They're both named James Meredith. But the first time that we ever went to Jackson, Mississippi to meet the family, his aunt and uncle sat down, and the words they gave me, which I later wrote about in the book, but they just said, we welcome you into this family. I was the first white woman to marry into the family. My sister-in-law, one of James's brothers, married a half Latino woman, but I'm the first white woman to marry in. And so they were very clear, and they said, we know you're wondering this, but Cara, we welcome you into our family. And the only thing we ask is that you understand the impact that James Sr. had upon the world. And so for me, that really has served as an invitation into it. And the invitation then, certainly in relearning history, learning about my father-in-law, but hordes of other, mostly leaders within the civil rights movement. But that also was simultaneously served as an invitation to enter into my own racial identity and like you were saying, whiteness. So for me, I'm completely enthralled. I sit here and go, okay, so can I get my PhD in history with a focus on this now? I mean, I'm starting to lean towards that. And what does that mean? What does that mean for us, no matter whether we identify as white or as people of color, to do the work and to not repeat the mistakes of history? Because there's nothing new under the sun. None of this, as you and I were talking about before the call, this is a lot of the hate, the racism that's rising up in our country right now. It's actually not anything new. There's no new rising of hate.
No, it's just coming. It's just being louder.
Yeah, it's
and
louder,
being amplified.
Yeah, and I think especially for those of us who are white, we're just noticing it for the first time.
Yes, I think you're so right. I mean, there was, this was a jokey SNL skit, but, if you remember, they did a skit where when Trump was winning, like all the white people were horrified and the black people were like, we know. Like, we knew how bad it was.
Yeah. Yeah. I do need to watch that one. We most recently watched Chris Farley with the Lunch Lady skit. So that was my last jump back, which was obviously way before mid-90s.
Totally.
But Sloppy Joe, it was an incredible moment. There you go.
So, what do you wish that white parents understood about raising black children and how to raise their children to be anti-racists? Because I know there's people interested in that, but they may not quite understand what that work looks like.
Absolutely. Um, there are so many thoughts, but I think the first is simply that it's a privilege not to have to talk about this.
Yeah.
And that's white privilege. It's a
Yeah.
privilege, and it's a form of white supremacy not to have conversations. And for all of us, no matter whether we're raising white kids or kids of color, it is a privilege not to have to enter into these conversations. And yet, for those of us who are raising Black and brown kids, we don't have a choice. We don't have a choice not to talk about this. For me, a lot of the work that I do now is alongside, a lot of the work that I did before the coronavirus hit the world was in partnering with different friends of color and leading seminars and conversations and just helping audiences, both white and people of color, enter into the conversation. And whether it's inviting people to do the work, which is because I think especially for parents, it's not just about skipping over who we are and then going straight to our kids.
Yes.
But it's saying, yes, we have to do the work ourselves. And it is okay to mess up. And it's okay to get this wrong. And it's okay just to continue to enter into the conversation, not just when a big viral incident happens.
Right.
And or when another Black or brown person loses their life, but on an everyday basis, when we're reading books, when we're watching movies, when we're walking down the street with masks on our faces. But what does it mean for us to keep talking about this? I think one of the most helpful things is to role play. And you can role play with other parents. You can look on the internet. I can send you stuff as well, but you can look up different incidents. What if this happens? What if this happened? Whether it's a conversation again that you're having with your kids or with another grown up, but what would your response be? So then actually starting to wrestle and talk through those things, but also being okay with getting it wrong.
Yeah.
I think that for a lot of us, and maybe this is me just speaking as a white woman, but we don't want to get it wrong.
Yes.
And so sometimes that fear of getting it wrong is what keeps us from saying anything at all.
I think you're absolutely right. And I actually think that white people's fear of getting it wrong or being called out, they can sometimes fear that more than racial acts of violence. Does that make sense? So we will be silent for fear of getting it wrong, which is so prideful and so uniquely white, that we will be silent and allow like injustice to happen just to make sure that we stay in our safe silo of not being called out for maybe using the wrong word or something like that.
Well, I mean, think about the story that I read at the beginning.
Yeah.
Every person, myself included, and I say every person in that line and the pharmacist and the pharmacist assistant, every person in that store was white.
Yeah.
At that time, my children were the only people of color in that general vicinity. Everyone went mute.
Yeah.
I mean, for myself, I was mute as tears ran down my face, not knowing what to say. But I just sat there later on going, okay, what if one person had said something?
Yeah.
What if one person had stuck up and stuck up for my children? And because it's not just my children, but it's all of our children.
Yeah.
And all of our children are going to continue to be affected, both white and kids of color, if we're not saying something.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, I think for a lot of white people of our generation, a lot of it is pushing past this sort of training that we had, like you were talking about, this colorblindness training where we've just become very uncomfortable talking about race at all. And I can remember an incident for myself where we went to see Alvin Ailey, which is, predominantly African-American dance troupe. And my daughter, who was, I think, about 5 at the time, said very loudly, and we were in the minority in the audience as well. Most of the audience was African-American, and my daughter said, "All the dancers are Black." And she said it really loud. And I remember my first instinct was like, oh my gosh, she said it. Like, she said it out loud. And then it's like, yes, they are. Like, I had to push past that and go, you're right. most of the dancers on stage are black. And it's okay that the black people around us heard a white girl notice that. And then we had the conversation of who Alvin Ailey was and how it was such a big deal that there was this black dance troupe that came out in the 60s and the historical, parts about that whole story. And, but I still, even now, have that, the first instinct is to shut it down. This feels scary.
Yeah.
And then I have to push past that, which is hard.
Yeah. Yeah. It is so hard. And yet, I just sit here and go, yet as we continue to dive into, that's our comfort, right?
Yes.
That's us as white people.
Yes.
Believing that we deserve comfort.
Yes.
And it's not just the comfort of our cozy little houses.
Yeah.
It's certainly more than that. It's the comfort that we feel we deserve. In conversations and from society. And
yes.
I had a couple weeks ago when all the Run with Maud stuff was going on. I finally was like, why am I feel like I've, on the one hand, especially with the coronavirus, I've just been in a space of being either super on social media or completely off, and just exhausted by a lot of stuff. And then I just realized I'm not posting about this because it's my privilege not to.
Right.
And so what am I doing here? But I had so many DMs from people just saying, okay, well, what if I post this and people don't like what I'm saying? And I'm like,
a kid got killed.
Yeah. So what's the bigger picture here?
Yeah.
And what's the bigger choice when it comes to the betterment and the good of society? And so we get to say something, and we get to say the hard things, and we also get to be corrected.
Yes.
And that's okay.
And
I think for you and I assume you have learned how to receive correction from your friends of color. And
yes, I bungle it all the time.
Absolutely. And I just go, okay, that could be my next book. One therapist suggested that. She said, maybe you should have a book about all the stuff black women have taught you. And I said, that would be a book. But for now, what does it mean to be okay with being corrected and to get it wrong? It's okay. It's okay.
Yes. Yes. I would rather be corrected and get it wrong than be silent. And, and the fact that I think so many white people would rather be silent than speak up for a murdered black boy is scary.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I feel like you're reworking MLK's famous thoughts on it's the silence of our friends hurts more than the words of our enemies.
It does hurt. It does hurt. Yeah. And I think even though I'm white, as a parent of black boys, that silence hurts too. Yeah. Absolutely. It's hard. But yeah, we white people have a lot to unpack. Just a whole lot to unpack, and it's a lot of internal work, isn't it?
It is.
And it's ongoing.
I loved this part of your book. I think it serves as an incredible invitation for readers to enter into the conversation. And I think a lot of folks are probably already on the same page with you, but also, no matter where we are, we get to continue to enter into the conversation. Yeah. And your stories, which is your story, serves as an invitation into that. Well, so thank you for doing that.
And yours too. I think your book was so relatable, and you were so vulnerable in talking about all of these issues, and for people to see this unfolding in your own life, I think is very informative. Where can people find you online, Cara?
Absolutely. So online, you can find me simply at my website, carameredith.com, Cara, and then Meredith, just like the women's last name. And then I'm on Instagram and Facebook at Cara Meredith Writes, and Twitter is CaraMac54.
Awesome. And I'll have links to both of our books underneath.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cara.
All right. Good being with you.